In the advanced section, we have a lesson on using the tag manager to pull the tags from the current scope you're in and then to use them in a custom resource. And so we have this Lambda function that is functioning as our custom resource, but it's got no tests. And we're going to look at a strategy for adding tests to this Lambda. So let's just have a quick overview of what it does. We have a type for the data coming through from CloudFormation for our use case, so the alarm, ARN and tags. And these are two fields that we defined ourselves. We've got an event coming through from CloudFormation which has some basic properties, and then depending on if it's a create, update or delete, has some slightly different ones. Then we have a type to encompass those three events. I haven't put the full Lambda context in, the full data you'd get for real, but we only need one property of it, so that was fine for our case. And then we have the data, or the shape of the data, going back to CloudFormation. We've got a function here that is adapted from an AWS example and is how the response to CloudFormation happens. They give us a signed URL and we give them a body with some particular data in. And then we've got our CloudWatch client in the v3 SDK being initialized, and the handler where we go ahead and use the CloudWatch client in some different cases. One of the challenges with Lambda, or a really easy thing to end up doing, is to have a handler that calls off to lots of other bits and pieces, lots of other services that are initialized somewhere else. And if we want to do a test for this handler, it's quite tempting to do some mocking of the dependencies like this CloudWatch client, but that can get really messy, especially if things leak between tests and we can't easily pass in a value. Just for some use cases we have to rely on, say, the mocking or stubbing functionality of the test tool we're using, and that's not always reliable in my view at least. So what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this function here and make a handler.ts, and then our handler in the handler.ts is going to be wrapped with another function, and we're going to call this function build handler, and we're going to pass in any dependency we have that we're going to use inside of the handler function. So we're going to use a CloudWatch client which is of type CloudWatch client. We'll get the one that we are making up here and take that away. We'll pop that in there, give it a bracket at the end, and then we can return in a function. So we've made a function that we call to generate our handler function. Then we can pop back to index.ts and we can do a bit of clearing out. So let's get rid of the types and this send response function because we're not using those. And then we're not going to build the handler function again. We're not going to make that. We're just going to call the build handler function from the other file. And oops, I forgot to export that. So let me pop that in there. So we're going to build the handler, and then we're going to pass in a CloudWatch client, which we've already got available. And then we need to export this here as the function handler. And I think I've got to add some exports to these types so that they're available to us in this file. So let me just do that quickly. Okay, great. I'm just going to clean up these dependencies for the things that we don't need anymore. And now we have a really, really simple index.ts that just creates the Lambda handler and builds the dependencies that it's going to need. And you might be thinking, well, what's the point? Why have we gone to the effort of splitting this out into two separate files? And why would we build our handler in this way? The reason we're using two files is so that we can create our own handler completely separately to all of this stuff. And obviously there aren't really side effects to making a CloudWatch client, but there might be things like creating a connection to a database or doing some lookups of some secrets, or really just some side effects. You might be wanting to try and avoid some of this configuration, some of this setup when you're writing your tests. Additionally, we've put the dependencies of this handler into the function so that we can really easily swap this out. We can swap it with a CloudWatch client for a different region, we can swap it with a test stub, anything we like, and there's no messing about with importing or changing the way that code is getting imported or required to route it to a different dependency. So let's write a test for this. Let's do handler.spec.ts, and then we're going to describe our alarm tagger, and let's describe a use case. So Let's say when we are creating a new alarm. And then we can say that it tags the alarm. Okay, so let's see how we can prepare our handler. We're going to use the before each method, so it gets run before every single test case. And then we're going to set up some local variables here that we can override. So we can say that we're going to have our CloudWatch client, and that's going to be a new CloudWatch client, like so. And then we can have our handler. I'll just leave that without type for a moment. And then we can say in the before each statement here, we're going to refresh our CloudWatch client. I'll tell you what, let's not initialize that at the start. Let's just pop that in here. And there we go. And then we can say the handler is going to be build handler with our CloudWatch client. But doing it this way would mean we actually have to interrogate the resources in CloudWatch after the fact, which we may or may not want to do. So let's look at using the AWS SDK Client mock package. So this package is super useful for mocking with the v3 SDK. And let's install that. Let's grab the name there. Lovely, and then we can import mock client from that package. And then we're going to wrap our call to the new CloudWatch client with mock client, like so. And the type's going to get a bit confused there because it's a stub, so actually let's separate that out. And let's say we're going to have the CloudWatch client mock as well, and we'll do it in two parts. We'll have the raw client, and then we'll have the mock here. Whoops. Great. Right, I think we're all ready to go. So by the time we get to our test case, we've now got a handler we can call with an event and context. And we've also got a CloudWatch client mock that we can do some assertions and bits and pieces on. So let's await the handler. And this will complain at us because we don't have a valid value for the event yet. And I'll tell you what, I'm just gonna type these as well. What's this one? AWS stub. And I need to double check what those type parameters will be. Input output configuration. So actually coming from the client. So I'll tell you what, we can do a little trick here. We can pop it into a temporary variable. We can see what the type of A is here, and if I'm quick enough and accurate enough with the mouse, which is not happening today, we'll be able to copy those types over. Then we can import those. Lovely, and then finally we need a type for our handler, which is going to be something that takes event and context and returns a promise void. So it's going to be a function taking event. Whoops, let's get that from the right place. The context. And then returns promise void, like so. Okay, has that got the right types? Yes, it does. So now we need an event. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pop to the console, and I'm going to go and have a look for an example case where I've actually had this Lambda function get called. Let's see if we can get one with the new logging in. And then I'm going to grab a real event that we can use in our test data. Let's pop that over here. We can say that we've got our event equals that big blob of data. Lovely. And then we can call the handler with that event, and then we need some context, and let's set the context in a separate variable actually as well. I think that's just a log stream name. Okay, what doesn't it like about this type? So physical ID is not set. I think this should be fine as a create event. There we go, just needed casting to the right thing. I'll tell you what, let's pop it up here. We'll set it when we define the variable, and then we don't have to cast it there. Okay, so now we've got a test that is calling our function here. And oops, I've missed the service token from the resource properties. So let's add that into the type. And then, yeah, we've got it, needs to be put in to the top as well. Let's add it to the base event. Lovely. All right, so types are all happy. We've got the event in there, and we're calling our handler with the CloudWatch client, but we don't have any mocking done yet, so it would try and call the real thing. So let's fix that. Let's say that we're going to set up our CloudWatch client mock .on, and then when we get a certain command, so we're going to call it tag resource command, and then we can do various options here. So we're going to say resolves once, and then I'm just going to give it an empty response, because we're not actually using the response coming back from the API call, so it doesn't really matter anyway. I like to use resolves once, sorry, because it shouldn't really be resolved multiple times. We shouldn't call tag resource multiple times, and sometimes this catches a little bug where something's leaking between tests or happening multiple times. So that handler should work, but it will try and report its success or failure, I should say, back to CloudFormation. And now we could host a little local server and change the response URL to be a server URL on our machine, and then we could do the test that way. Or we could use a library like nock, and the library and what nock does is lets us mock out a HTTP request and lets us record HTTP requests as well. So let's pop nock in here. Great, and then we can see how we can use it with the recorder. Here we go. So we do that at the start, then this at the end. So let's do our stuff. Let's do the call to CloudFormation, and I need to do an import of nock. Whoops. And then we can do nock.recorder.play at the end, and let's see what happens. So let's do an npm test. Whoops, I don't think the test configuration is happy with co-located tests. So, there we go. It doesn't have spec specified, and I'm used to the .spec.ts version. So let's add that in the config. We don't really mind if this test fails or succeeds here because it's not really relevant to us. But I'm just going to pop in those two values just as empty strings, so the other test will compile now. Okie dokie, did that run our test? No, it didn't. Let's see how that targeting is working again. Sorry, I forgot to add lib in there as well. Okay. All right, let's see if our test failed as well. Okie dokie, cannot read properties on of undefined. Let's go and have a look at what's happening with our mock. So before each, that should be set up. Oops, I forgot to change that const a back to the proper version where it's setting the value. Let me just check I've imported all those types from the right place. No, I haven't. I've imported one of them from SES. All right, put that over there. Give it a save. Okay, one more time. All right, so nock has given us a recording of this request. Now this request will fail because the response URL has already been used or will have expired by now. But actually CloudFormation's given us a 200 back anyway. It seems to be okay with that, even though it's an old or stale request. So what we've done here is we've got this huge blob of data, but it's taking in all the request parameters and then popping back a valid HTTP response. So if we take the recorder we've got off now, so we've got nock.recorder.rec, nock.recorder.play, and we can run it again. And the test passes. So it made the HTTP call, it got mocked, we made a call to CloudWatch, that got mocked as well, and we verified that our handler works. And we can do an assertion if we like on the mock here, so we get a list of calls from the CloudWatch mock and we can do assertions on those, or we can use a jest plugin to make that a little bit neater. So there we go. That was an example of adding a bit of testing to our Lambda function. We split it out into two files. We have an index.ts where all of the dependencies are initialized and passed into a function that builds our handler. In the handler.ts file, we have just that wrapper function there with all the dependencies in, and then everything else as normal. And that meant that we can stub and mock things out as we wish. And it meant that we're not importing this index.ts file in the tests, and so we're not causing the initialization of all these dependencies and data stores. And then we did a bit of a test case using the AWS SDK Client mock library for version 3 resource, version 3 SDK response. And we had our handler using an HTTP request that is mocked with nock. And obviously you're going to have your own opinions about how much mocking you should or shouldn't do, but I just wanted to demonstrate it as a bit of a technique.